"You are no longer in the will," my father read calmly, pulling a folded paper from his suit pocket. He never raised his voice. The cruelest part was that everyone around the dining table already knew, including my mother. I did not cry or argue. I just took my husband by the hand and walked out. Exactly 8 months later, I returned to turn that very table into a legal battlefield. My name is Madison Washington. If you know the name in Charlotte, North Carolina, you know it comes with a certain weight. I grew up on the shores of Lake Norman, an expanse of water just north of the city where old money and new ambition collide in a spectacle of manicured lawns and private docks. In our world, wealth was not something you simply enjoyed. It was a uniform. It was a fortress. But above all, it was a legacy. Our family was conservative, deeply entrenched in the kind of Southern traditions that prized keeping up appearances far more than fostering genuine affection. We were expected to be perfect investments, compounding in value with every passing year. The estate we lived in was a sprawling stone mansion with 7 bedrooms, massive iron gates, and a private dock housing 2 speedboats that rarely saw the water. The house was designed to intimidate, not to comfort. Walking through the grand foyer felt like entering a corporate headquarters rather than a home. The air always felt climate-controlled to a crisp, unwelcoming 68 degrees. The architect of this suffocating empire was my father, Theodore Washington. He was the founder and chief executive officer of Washington Signature Communities, a luxury real estate development firm that had paved over half the county with gated neighborhoods, equestrian centers, and championship golf courses. To my father, a child was no different than a prime piece of commercial real estate. We were acquisitions. We required capital, maintenance, and strict zoning laws, and in return, we were expected to yield a predictable, substantial return on investment by the time we reached our late 20s. He did not love us in the way a father reads a bedtime story or bandages a scraped knee. He loved us the way a board member loves a quarterly earnings report that exceeds expectations by 15%. My mother, Celeste Washington, was the soft velvet draped over the cold iron of my father. She was elegance personified, a woman who spoke in a voice so mild and soothing it could disarm a hurricane. She was the master of the dining room table, effortlessly ensuring the silver was polished and the crystal caught the light just right. But beneath her immaculate silk blouses and perfectly styled hair, she was a woman who had survived decades of marriage not by resolving conflicts, but by completely avoiding them. If my father was the storm, my mother was the heavily insulated panic room. She pretended the thunder was just a passing train. "Pass the salt, please," she would say, smiling placidly while the air in the room grew thick enough to choke on. She spent her days organizing charity galas and attending garden club meetings, carefully curating an illusion of domestic bliss that cost thousands of dollars a month to maintain. My older sister, Brenna Washington Kendrick, learned the rules of the house early and played them to perfection. She married a fiercely ambitious man named Preston Kendrick. Together, they lived exactly the kind of life Theodore Washington demanded of his offspring. They had a sprawling house in the prestigious Myers Park neighborhood, 2 luxury European sport utility vehicles in the driveway, and a way of speaking that always sounded like they were pitching a venture capital firm. "We are projecting a massive growth quarter," Preston would say over roasted duck, cutting his meat with the aggressive precision of a surgeon. Brenna would nod, her smile bright and vacant, playing the role of the ultimate corporate wife. They were my father's most successful subsidiaries. They never questioned the blueprint. They just asked how to build it taller. Then there was my younger brother, Cole Washington. Cole was placed in the operations department of the family company straight out of college, handed a respectable salary and a title that meant nothing. He was caught in the miserable purgatory between compliance and rebellion. He was not strong enough to stand up to our father, yet he was not quite callous enough to become an exact replica of him. Cole would often stare down at his plate during family meals, pushing his peas around, his shoulders perpetually slumped under the invisible weight of the Washington name. He was the middle management of our family dynamic, absorbing the blows from the top but lacking the authority to change the structure. I often caught him staring out the window toward the lake, looking like a man serving a life sentence in a country club. For a long time, I was the chosen heir. I was the child who was supposed to take the reins. From a very young age, I had a gift for numbers. While other children were reading comic books, I was analyzing balance sheets and understanding complex financial structures. The language of assets, liabilities, and equity made perfect sense to me. It was clean. It was honest. Numbers, unlike people, did not lie to protect their egos. By the time I was 16 years old, I could read a corporate tax return better than some certified public accountants. Because of this aptitude, my father groomed me. He brought me into his home office, showing me land acquisition deals, zoning permits, and tax mitigation strategies involving multiple limited liability companies. He expected me to step into the executive suite of Washington's signature communities the moment I received my master's degree. Instead, I walked away. I refused to work for the family company. I took my skills and became a senior forensic accountant at Blue Aster Risk Group. I wanted to build a life on my own merit, earning my own paycheck, unraveling financial frauds and uncovering the truth in ledgers that belonged to strangers. My job was to find the hidden rot inside beautiful corporate structures, an irony that was never lost on me. That independent career choice created a deeply complicated dynamic between my father and me. On one hand, he was incredibly proud that I possessed the sharp, predatory intellect required to succeed in forensic accounting. He liked that I was ruthless with data. On the other hand, my choice deeply annoyed and threatened him. Theodore Washington understood, perhaps better than anyone, that I was the only person in our entire bloodline smart enough to look at his books and see straight through the smokescreens he spent his life building. I was the wild card he could not control. I was the auditor living inside his own house. My entire youth, and well into my adulthood, was defined by the oppressive atmosphere of our family dinners. Our dining room was a grand, echoing space with a massive mahogany table that could easily seat 20 people, though there were usually only the 6 of us. A massive crystal chandelier hung above us, casting a bright, unforgiving light on every flaw, every hesitation, every poorly chosen word. The wallpaper was a heavy, dark silk that seemed to absorb the oxygen in the room. The true terror of Theodore Washington was that he never needed to raise his voice. He never slammed his fists on the table. He never shouted. He ruled through a masterclass of silent intimidation and surgical psychological strikes. If the conversation drifted toward a topic he disliked, or if someone expressed an opinion that did not align with his worldview, he would simply stop eating. He would slowly place his heavy silver fork down on the fine porcelain plate with a quiet, sharp metallic click. Then, he would look up. It was just a glance. A chilling, dead-eyed stare that carried the weight of 1,000 reprimands. He would let the silence stretch for 5, 10, sometimes 15 agonizing seconds. The sheer force of his disappointment would press down on the room until you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. Then, he would deliver a single, perfectly timed, sarcastic remark. I suppose that is an interesting perspective, if you intend to remain middle class forever, he might say, picking up his wine glass and taking a slow, measured sip. Or, if Cole had tried to suggest a new operational strategy, my father would tilt his head and murmur, "It is fascinating how much time you dedicate to ideas that generate zero revenue. Perhaps we should transfer you to a non-profit organization." Those brief, sharp words were all it took. Instantly, the entire table would self-correct. Brenna would rapidly change the subject to country club renovations or an upcoming charity gala. Celeste would frantically offer everyone more roasted asparagus or pour more wine, her hands trembling just slightly. Cole would shrink further into his heavy wooden chair, his face flushing a deep, humiliated red. Preston would nod aggressively, signaling his unwavering allegiance to the patriarch. Like a solar system bound by a harsh, inescapable gravity, we would all scramble to fall back into the exact orbit our father demanded. Nobody dared to challenge the gravitational pull. Nobody dared to leave the table. I sat through hundreds of those dinners. I learned to keep my face entirely neutral, a skill that later served me perfectly when interrogating embezzling executives who thought they could outsmart me. I learned to count the seconds of silence. I learned to measure the exact temperature of my father's anger by the tightness of his jaw and the rhythm of his breathing. I existed in that suffocating, highly controlled environment for 35 years, observing, calculating, and surviving. I thought I knew exactly how his games were played. I thought I knew the limits of his cruelty. But I had no idea just how far he was willing to go to maintain his absolute control over the Washington legacy. Nor did I realize that my ultimate rebellion would begin not with a shout, but with a quiet, undeniable love that he could not buy, intimidate, or index in a spreadsheet. I met Lucas Hale in a windowless conference room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and ozone. It was the frantic aftermath of a Category 4 hurricane that had recently battered the Carolina coast. My firm, Blue Aster Risk Group, had been retained to audit a series of highly suspicious insurance claims on newly built housing developments that had folded like cheap paper under the wind. Lucas was sitting on the opposite side of the scarred wooden table. He was a plaintiff's attorney at Harbor Lane Council, representing 3 construction workers who had been severely injured when a poorly framed roof collapsed on top of them. The men my father usually arranged for me to meet at his endless charity galas and foundation dinners were virtually identical to one another. They wore custom Italian suits, possessed degrees from Ivy League universities, and spoke entirely in the future tense about market shares, asset management, and corporate acquisitions. Lucas was a jarring departure from that world. He wore a charcoal suit that fit well enough, but was clearly purchased off the rack. He had the rough, broad hands of a man who actually knew how to build the structures my father's friends only financed. Before attending law school at night, Lucas had spent 8 years working as a commercial electrician. He knew the building codes inside and out because he had pulled the heavy wires through the drywall himself. There was no grand, cinematic spark when we first met. It was an intellectual collision. I was ruthlessly searching for fraudulent supply chain invoices and mismanaged funds. He was hunting for the corporate negligence that broke his clients' legs. Within 2 hours of sparring over liability clauses and indemnity agreements, I realized something profoundly disarming. Lucas Hale was not afraid of me. He did not care about the heavy legacy attached to the name printed on my business card. He did not look at me and see a trust fund or a strategic alliance for his own career. He simply saw a sharp, capable accountant standing in the way of his clients receiving fair compensation. Our relationship did not unfold in 5-star restaurants or on the decks of private yachts. It grew steadily in the quiet, exhausted spaces of adult life. We shared late dinners at 9 o'clock at night in empty diners, splitting lukewarm French fries while passionately debating the ethical boundaries of corporate risk and personal liability. I found myself intensely drawn to his steadiness. Lucas possessed a fundamental, unbreakable kindness, but it was not a soft or yielding trait. It was the kind of kindness that had been tested by hardship. He never flattered people in power, and he certainly did not flinch when wealth attempted to flex its muscles. Slowly, gently, he began to pull me out of the defensive, calculated crouch I had lived in for over 30 years. "You do not have to calculate every single word you say when you are with me," he told me one evening, leaning across the small kitchen island of my apartment. "I am not grading your performance, Madison. I am not looking for a return on my investment. You can just breathe." It was a revolutionary concept. For the first time in my entire existence, I felt loved for exactly who I was, not for the influence I could leverage or the optics I provided. Naturally, my family reacted to Lucas the way a host immune system reacts to a dangerous foreign pathogen. Theodore Washington did not object to Lucas based on anything as crude or obvious as race. My father's prejudices were strictly tied to class, aura, and utility. To my father, a lawyer who actively sued powerful developers on behalf of blue-collar workers was not just a poor romantic match. He was a walking existential threat. Lucas represented the exact demographic my father spent his life quietly exploiting to build his massive real estate empire. The first time I brought Lucas home to the lake house for a Sunday afternoon lunch, the atmosphere was a masterclass in polite, suffocating hostility. My mother, Celeste, deployed her weaponized hospitality. She smiled brightly, her eyes completely dead, and asked Lucas endlessly patronizing questions about the charm of attending a public state university. My sister, Brenna, gave him a cool, dismissive nod upon introduction and spent the entire afternoon intensely discussing the intricate financial details of a country club renovation, ensuring Lucas had absolutely no context to join the conversation. Preston, my brother-in-law, was far less subtle. I found out 3 weeks later through a mutual contact in the banking sector that Preston had quietly run a comprehensive, unauthorized background check on Lucas. He had combed public records searching for bankruptcies, past arrests, or unpaid debts to use as ammunition. He found absolutely nothing but a clean record and a heavy burden of student loans that Lucas paid on time every single month. But it was my father who orchestrated the true psychological warfare. He never insulted Lucas directly. Instead, he wrapped his contempt in the suffocating blanket of parental concern. "It is just that a plaintiff's practice is so terribly unstable," my father would say, swirling his expensive scotch while looking at the stone fireplace rather than making eye contact with Lucas. "We just worry about Madison's comfort. She is accustomed to a very specific standard of security. Surely you understand that, Lucas, it is a harsh, unpredictable world for idealists." Lucas never took the bait. He would just smile calmly, his posture relaxed and unbothered, and reply, "I make a good living, Mr. Washington, and Madison makes her own. I think we are entirely secure." The defining turning point, the exact moment the Cold War turned into active hostility, happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the middle of leading a complex forensic audit at the office when my phone vibrated. It was a screenshot sent from Lucas. It showed a calendar invitation accepted by my father at a highly exclusive, members-only cigar lounge located in the financial district. When I met Lucas at his modest apartment that evening, he did not look angry. He just looked deeply, profoundly tired. He poured me a glass of cold water, sat beside me on the worn fabric sofa, and took a deep breath. "Your father asked me to meet him at 4 o'clock today," Lucas said, his voice steady but carrying a heavy weight. He ordered a $200 pour of whiskey for himself and a glass of tap water for me. He talked for 20 minutes about the immense burden of legacy and the high cost of maintaining a dynasty. Then, he reached into his jacket and slid a cashier's check across the mahogany table. My stomach plummeted. I felt the blood rapidly drain from my face, leaving me cold. "How much?" I asked, though I was terrified to hear the number. $500,000, Lucas replied, his eyes locked firmly onto mine. He told me it was seed money to start my own independent law firm in another state. He said it was a highly generous grant for me to realize my full potential, provided I understood that I was fundamentally unsuited to navigate the complexities of the Washington family. "What did you do?" I whispered, my hands trembling slightly against the glass of water. "I left the check sitting on the table," Lucas said simply. "I told him my integrity was not for sale, and certainly not at such a steep discount. I kept the text messages confirming the meeting and the location. I wanted you to know exactly what happened, directly from me, before he tried to spin a different, cleaner narrative to you." I sat there in the quiet of his living room, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. The scales completely fell from my eyes. This was no longer a simple, predictable case of wealthy parents disapproving of a working-class son-in-law. This was a naked declaration of war. My father had quantified my worth on a piece of paper and attempted to buy out my partner like a hostile corporate takeover. In that moment, I understood the absolute, undeniable truth. If I chose to marry Lucas Hale, my father would not see it as a romantic decision or a milestone in his daughter's life. He would view it as an act of open public rebellion against his empire. I looked at the man sitting next to me, the man who had walked away from $500,000 just to keep his promise to me, and I knew my answer. The family blueprint was flawed. and I was finally ready to tear it up. We married on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. There was no grand cathedral, no string quartet, and no guest list consisting of 400 strategic corporate partners. We stood before a judge in a modest courthouse room, exchanged our vows, and celebrated with a simple dinner alongside 5 close friends at a small, dimly lit Italian restaurant. It was honest. It was entirely ours. I felt a profound sense of peace, believing I had finally stepped off the stage my father had built for me. Exactly 6 weeks later, my phone rang. It was my mother, Celeste. Her voice sounded thin, carrying a rehearsed, fragile quality that instantly made my shoulders tense. "Madison, darling," she began, the forced sweetness dripping from every syllable. "Your father and I want to host a family dinner this Saturday. We want to start over properly. We want to officially welcome Lucas into the fold." I should have known immediately that the word properly in my family's vocabulary was synonymous with strategically. When Lucas and I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the lake house exactly at 7 o'clock that Saturday evening, the atmosphere was entirely wrong. A home, even a cold one, has a certain rhythm to it. This space felt like a stage set moments before the curtain rises on a tragedy. Walking into the formal dining room, the immediate red flags were blinding. The massive mahogany table was set with the intricate, gold-rimmed bone china that was strictly reserved for monumental announcements or entertaining politicians. More unsettling was the tableau of the people waiting for us. Everyone was already seated. Nobody was lingering by the bar cart or chatting in the adjoining living room. My father, Theodore, sat at the head of the table wearing a structured dark navy blazer over a crisp white shirt. It was an incredibly formal, aggressive choice for a private evening inside his own home. At the opposite end, my brother-in-law, Preston, leaned back in his chair. He was swirling a glass of expensive red wine with a relaxed, deeply arrogant smirk playing on his lips. He looked far too comfortable. He looked exactly like a man who had been handed the agenda beforehand and was thoroughly enjoying the anticipated show. We took our seats. The dinner that followed was an exercise in suffocating tension. I cannot recall what we were served for the main course. The food tasted like ash. The only sounds were the heavy clinking of silver forks against fine porcelain, striking the plates like gavels hitting a judge's block. Every polite, meaningless question lobbed across the table felt entirely hollow. As soon as the plates were cleared, the illusion of hospitality vanished. My father did not ask the staff to bring out coffee or dessert. Instead, he reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored blazer and withdrew a thick, neatly stapled stack of heavy bond paper. He placed it squarely on the table in front of him, pressing his large hands flat against the top page. His face was entirely devoid of emotion, a perfect mask of corporate execution. "In light of recent transitions within our family structure," he began, his voice dropping into its most authoritative, commanding register, "I felt it was strictly necessary to be entirely transparent about the restructuring of our family assets." He did not look at me. He opened the document and began to read aloud from what was clearly an updated draft of his last will and testament, coupled with an amendment to the family living trust. The legal language was suffocatingly precise and thoroughly devastating. Effective immediately, Madison, Washington was entirely excised from the inheritance. My designated seat on the board of the Family Philanthropic Foundation was revoked. My beneficiary status regarding the lakefront properties, the commercial holdings, and the liquid investment accounts was permanently terminated. Every single asset, every share of stock, every piece of the legacy I was born into was being divided cleanly and irrevocably between Brenna and Cole. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I felt a strange, icy clarity wash over my entire body. I let him finish reading the primary clauses before I spoke. "Why?" I asked. It was a single, perfectly flat syllable. I did not ask because I wanted to beg for my share back. I asked because I wanted him to put his cruelty on the official record. My father finally looked up, his eyes locking onto mine with chilling indifference. He did not say he hated the man I married. He did not yell about disobedience. That would have been too human, too vulnerable. Instead, he deployed his deadliest weapon, corporate justification. I simply cannot allow the family legacy to drift into a household associated with litigation, financial instability, and fundamentally misaligned values, he stated evenly. A dynasty requires fierce protection from unnecessary risk. The word risk was a poisoned arrow aimed directly at Lucas, who sat perfectly still beside me, his jaw clenched tight. But the true, unadulterated brutality of the night did not come from the loss of money. It came from the deafening silence that followed my father's declaration. I looked around the long table, desperately searching for a gasp of shock, a word of protest, or any sign of objection from the people I shared blood with. There was absolutely nothing. My mother kept her eyes firmly glued to her empty water glass, her hands folded tightly in her lap, playing the role of the silent bystander to perfection. Brenna gripped the delicate stem of her wine glass so hard her knuckles turned completely white, staring blankly at the wall behind me. Cole looked physically ill, his face pale and slick with a thin sheen of cold sweat. Yet he remained mute, too cowardly to defend his sister. And Preston simply watched me, his expression radiating pure, undisguised satisfaction. They all knew. They had all sat down to this elaborate dinner fully aware that they were attending my execution. As my father turned to the final page to read the summary clauses, the forensic accountant inside my brain automatically zeroed in on the text visible from across the table. My eyes caught a specific, highly unusual schedule listed in the appendix. It was a clause detailing the explicit revocation of my signing authority on several older limited liability companies. The wording was peculiar. It explicitly stated my removal effective 30 days prior, phrasing the legal jargon as though I had been actively maintaining those business entities well after my wedding day. That was factually impossible and legally highly suspicious. I had surrendered all my security tokens, physical keys, and digital access credentials the exact week I declined my position at his firm years ago. Why would a newly drafted, airtight legal document need to sever financial ties that had supposedly been dead for a decade? My mind raced, rapidly filing away the anomaly, but my face remained an impenetrable mask. Beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, I felt a warm, strong hand slide over my knee. It was Lucas. His grip was steady and grounding, silently communicating that we were an unbreakable front and this room could not destroy us. I placed my hand over his and squeezed back. I took a slow, steadying breath. Then, I stood up. The harsh scraping of my wooden chair against the polished hardwood floor sounded like a gunshot in the deadened room. I looked at the man at the head of the table, then at the mother who bore me, and finally at the siblings who had just silently agreed to sell me out for a larger piece of the financial pie. "Thank you for dinner," I said. My voice was chillingly calm, devoid of any anger, sorrow, or hesitation. The food was lovely. I turned and walked toward the grand foyer, Lucas falling into step right beside me. We walked out the heavy oak doors into the cool, dark night air. We did not look back. We left behind a dining room trapped in a dead, suffocating silence, feeling exactly like a room that had just witnessed a flawless execution, only to slowly realize they had just signed a death sentence for their own honor. The morning after we walked out of the lake house, I did not wake up with a burning desire to wage war. I woke up to the quiet hum of our apartment and the smell of dark roast coffee. I picked up my phone, navigated to my contacts, and systematically blocked my father, my mother, Brenna, Preston, and Cole. I did not send a final scathing text message. I did not post a passive-aggressive quote on my social media feeds. I did not draft a lengthy email demanding an explanation. I simply severed the cord. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the heavy, echoing quiet of a vault finally slamming shut. Lucas did not try to be the cinematic hero who promised to avenge my honor. He understood that grief over the death of a family relationship is not linear. Some days I felt a profound, airy sense of freedom. Other days, a sudden, sharp anger would seize my chest while I was washing the dishes. paralyzing me. Lucas never rushed me through those moments. He would simply stand beside me, take the wet sponge from my hand, and wait. He expects a reaction. Madison, Lucas murmured one evening as we sat on the balcony, watching the streetlights flicker on. Your father built that entire spectacle assuming you would panic. He wants you to show up at his corporate office on Monday morning, asking what you have to do to earn your seat back. Your silence is the one variable he never modeled in his projections. I channeled every ounce of that displaced energy into my work at Blue Aster Risk Group. I requested the most convoluted file in the office, a massive vendor fraud investigation involving a regional hospital system and dozens of phantom supply companies. The messier the financial web, the better. I spent 10 hours a day tracing illicit wire transfers, cross-referencing fake invoices, and mapping out the concealed ownership of shell corporations. Unraveling someone else's deception became my therapy. Every time I found a hidden asset or exposed a fabricated ledger, it felt like I was reclaiming a small piece of my own agency. My professional skills and my personal pain had perfectly aligned to make me relentless. While I was tearing down fraudulent structures, Lucas was busy building a formidable reputation in the exact arenas my father desperately wished to keep him out of. Lucas secured a massive, unprecedented victory in a workplace safety lawsuit against a major commercial contractor. The trial resulted in a 7-figure settlement for a paralyzed crane operator. Suddenly, Lucas was not just a nuisance, he was a precedent. His name was featured in the local business journal, printed on the very pages I knew my father meticulously reviewed every single morning over his black coffee. The irony was exquisite. My father had tried to buy Lucas off for $500,000, and now Lucas was costing my father's industry peers 10 times that amount in safety compliance and legal penalties. By the time autumn arrived, we decided it was time to leave the apartment and build something permanent. We did not look at gated communities or newly developed estates. Instead, we bought a charming, slightly neglected bungalow built in the 1920s, located in the historic Ashbury Park neighborhood. The roof needed patching, the hardwood floors were scratched, and the kitchen looked like it had not been updated since the 1970s. It was perfect. We spent our weekends covered in drywall dust and primer. We sanded the original oak floors ourselves, our knees aching, laughing when we accidentally spilled wood stain on the baseboards. We spent hours in hardware stores, arguing playfully over whether the porch light should be brushed brass or matte black. Every single dollar we poured into that house came from our own paychecks. There were no wire transfers from a family trust, no strings attached to the mortgage, and no quiet expectations of loyalty in exchange for the down payment. It was 100% ours. By late November, the bungalow was finally ready to be a home. We bought a large, slightly mismatched farmhouse table from a local antique market and placed it right in the center of the dining room. We started opening our doors. We hosted loud, chaotic dinners filled with Lucas's friends from the construction trades, my sharp-witted colleagues from the accounting firm, and neighbors who just dropped by to see the renovations. I vividly remember sitting at that table on a chilly Friday night. The room was filled with the smell of roasted garlic, the sound of genuinely loud laughter, and the clinking of cheap beer bottles. I looked down the length of the wood. For the first time in 35 years, I realized I was entirely relaxed. I did not have to monitor the mood of the person sitting at the head of the table. I did not have to carefully weigh my words to avoid triggering a silent, suffocating freeze. A table was supposed to be a place of nourishment and warmth, not a stage for psychological warfare. I had finally found my seat. But just as the scars were beginning to turn into smooth skin, the past reached out and dragged its nails across my front door. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the mail arrived. Mixed in with the electric bill and a couple of catalogs was a thick certified letter from a prominent title insurance and escrow company. I opened it at the kitchen island, a cup of tea cooling beside me. The document was a formal notice of a guarantor obligation. It stated that a commercial loan attached to a specific land development parcel was on the verge of default, and as a signed personal guarantor, I was legally bound to cover the deficit. I stared at the paper, the breath completely knocked out of my lungs. The legal entity listed on the default notice was one of the obscure subsidiaries of Washington Signature Communities. It was the exact same limited liability company I had noticed in the appendix during the disastrous dinner at the lake house. I pulled my laptop out and immediately accessed the public registry. I paid the nominal fee and downloaded the full amendment to the commercial loan. I scrolled down to the signature page. There it was. My name, electronically signed and verified, pledging personal liability for a multi-million-dollar debt. I checked the timestamp on the digital signature. It was dated exactly 2 weeks after my wedding day. It was a date when I was on my honeymoon, thousands of miles away, entirely disconnected from anything related to my father's business. Furthermore, it was years after I had supposedly surrendered all my corporate access. The warm, comforting walls of my bungalow suddenly felt very cold. I set the document down on the marble counter. The pieces of the puzzle rapidly snapped together in my mind, forming a terrifying picture: the dinner, the theatrical reading of the new trust, the public, humiliating severing of ties. It had absolutely nothing to do with punishing me for marrying a working-class lawyer. My father had not cut me out of the will out of spite. He had orchestrated that entire evening to legally and publicly isolate me from the family structure right before the financial rot began to surface. He needed me out of the inner circle so I could not see the collapsing ledgers, but he kept my digital ghost alive just long enough to anchor his bad debt to my name. The dinner was not an execution of my inheritance. It was the framing of a scapegoat. I turned the farmhouse table in my dining room into a forensic war room. Armed with a constantly refilled mug of dark roast coffee and my encrypted work laptop, I bypassed the sleep I desperately needed and plunged headfirst into the digital labyrinth of public county records, corporate filings, and commercial mortgage histories tied directly to Washington's Signature Communities. The state registry was a massive, intentionally confusing haystack of legal jargon, but I was a senior forensic accountant. I did not just look for the needle, I looked for the displaced hay, the irregular patterns, and the silent spaces where the money disappeared. Within 72 hours, the pristine, invincible facade of my father's real estate empire began to peel away, revealing a terrifying level of structural rot underneath. I meticulously mapped out the lakefront parcels. To the public eye, they were prime, highly sought-after real estate awaiting luxury development. To my trained eyes, reading the county clerk records, they were ticking financial time bombs. My father had cross-collateralized almost every single lot. A primary construction loan taken out on one parcel was being dangerously used to secure a mezzanine loan on a second parcel, which in turn backed a revolving credit line for a third. It was a massive, precarious house of cards built on artificially inflated appraisals. Furthermore, I traced highly irregular, rapid-fire cash flows filtering through a web of newly registered limited liability companies. I found 3 separate shell entities that had been quietly incorporated in the state of Delaware precisely 6 weeks before that unforgettable family dinner. They had no employees, no physical office space, and no operational history, yet they were moving hundreds of thousands of dollars in supposed consulting fees. While my family's legacy was secretly hemorrhaging cash and drowning in leveraged debt, my own career was accelerating rapidly and cleanly. At Blue Aster Risk Group, I successfully closed the hospital vendor fraud case. I spent weeks tracking phantom invoices and eventually traced exactly $2,400,000 of embezzled funds to a fake medical supplier operating out of a residential basement. The senior partners at the firm called me into the glass-walled boardroom on a Thursday afternoon. They formally initiated the process to promote me to a senior management director position. I was ascending purely on my own merit, completely untethered from the heavy, suffocating weight of the Washington name. My success was built on truth, not leverage. Meanwhile, Lucas was making his own seismic waves in the exact arenas my father sought to control. On a Tuesday evening, I sat on my living room sofa and watched my husband sit under the bright studio lights of our local television news station. He was invited for a 15-minute segment to discuss his recent, massive courtroom victory and the appalling lack of safety oversight in local commercial zoning, Lucas did not shout. He spoke calmly and methodically, dismantling the exact regulatory loopholes that wealthy developers like my father routinely exploited to maximize their profit margins while endangering workers. Lucas was no longer just a legal nuisance. He was actively shifting public perception in a territory Theodore Washington considered his absolute, untouchable kingdom. The inevitable collision of these two rapidly moving worlds arrived via a glowing screen at 2 o'clock in the morning. My phone vibrated intensely against the wooden nightstand. It was a text message from my younger brother, Cole. It contained only 3 desperate words. "We need to talk," I replied immediately, asking if he was safe, but my brother went completely dark. 2 agonizing days passed in total radio silence before he finally sent a secure, encrypted message with a time and a location. We met at 9 o'clock at night in the desolate, sprawling parking lot of a massive discount supermarket located right on the edge of the city limits. The sodium vapor lights cast a sickly, artificial orange glow over the damp asphalt. Cole was sitting inside his idling sedan, parked in the furthest, darkest corner. When I pulled up and slid into his passenger seat, the heavy scent of stale fear, nervous sweat, and cheap peppermint gum filled the small, enclosed space. My brother looked completely shattered. He looked at least a decade older than his actual age, with dark, bruised circles under his eyes and a nervous tremor in his hands. "He has people watching the corporate office. Madison," Cole whispered immediately, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned a stark white. "I cannot stay long. If Preston finds out I am talking to you, I am entirely finished." "What is happening, Cole? Tell me exactly what you see," I instructed, keeping my voice low, authoritative, and perfectly steady to anchor his spiraling panic. He let out a ragged, trembling breath. "The company is completely illiquid. We are drowning in paper debt. The new equestrian estate project is over budget by at least $4 million, and the primary lenders are aggressively refusing to extend the grace periods. The cash reserves are just gone." Cole swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward his rearview mirror. "And Dad gave Preston the absolute keys to the kingdom. Preston is managing the contractor disbursements, but he has absolutely no idea what he is doing. Or worse, he knows exactly what he is doing and does not care. He is bleeding the operational accounts dry, funneling money to his own preferred vendors, and Dad completely refuses to rein him in. Dad is obsessed with keeping up the visual optics." I absorbed the magnitude of the financial disaster. It validated everything I had found in the public records. But a mismanaged budget was not the reason my terrified brother had risked this clandestine, late-night meeting. Cole reached into his heavy jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of standard printer paper. His hands were violently shaking as he handed it across the center console. "I was pulling the quarterly compliance files for an internal audit," Cole explained, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "I found this buried in a deeply nested secondary server directory. I printed a physical copy of the screenshot exactly 10 minutes before Preston's security guy purged the backup logs." I unfolded the paper under the dim yellow dome light of the car. It was a scanned, low-resolution copy of a commercial mezzanine loan addendum. It was a legally binding document pledging personal assets to cover a massive corporate debt shortfall in the event of a default. My eyes rapidly scanned the boilerplate legal text, bypassing the standard clauses, and moved directly down to the guarantor's signature line. Right there, stamped in stark, undeniable black ink, was a stylized electronic initial, M. Washington. "Look at the execution date," Cole urged quietly, his voice barely a breath. I checked the timestamp on the digital notary seal printed at the bottom corner of the page. The air left my lungs. The document had been executed 4 months after my wedding, long after I had left the company, and long after my father had publicly cut me out of the family structure. It confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. He had not exiled me because of Lucas. He had isolated me so I would lose visibility, then tied my name to the company's debt so I would absorb the fallout when the fraud surfaced. The phone rang on a Thursday afternoon. The caller identification displayed a number I had deliberately blocked months ago, but she had circumvented the barrier by calling my direct office line. I picked up the receiver. "Madison, darling," my mother said. Her voice was remarkably soft, carrying a fragile, breathless quality. "I simply want to talk. Just a mother and her daughter catching up over a cup of tea." I leaned back in my desk chair. A younger, more desperate version of myself might have heard maternal longing in those syllables. The current version of me, trained to detect fraud, heard panic beneath every word. "If you want to talk, we can meet at the coffee shop on Elm Street tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "And Lucas will be sitting right beside me." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Oh, Madison, must we involve outsiders in family matters?" "Lucas is my husband," I stated clearly. "He is my family. If he is not welcome, then we have absolutely nothing to discuss." She surrendered with a defeated sigh. The following morning, the cafe was mostly empty. Celeste Washington walked through the glass doors wearing an immaculate beige trench coat and a silk scarf, projecting the visual illusion of a woman without a single care in the world. However, the brittle tension around her mouth and the frantic darting of her eyes betrayed her. She sat across from Lucas and me, clutching a thick, brown leather tote bag. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask about our new home. She simply reached into her bag and slid a heavy manila envelope across the wooden table. "Your father has been so terribly stressed lately," my mother began, staring at her untouched cappuccino. "He says the market is just experiencing a minor correction. But he is snapping at the staff, and he locks the study doors at night. He asked me to organize his home desk, and I found these. I do not understand the terminology. Madison, I just need you to look over some numbers for me." She spoke as though the brutal exile I had endured was merely a temporary misunderstanding. I placed my hand firmly flat on top of the envelope, but did not open it. "I will not be your secret consultant," I told her, my voice low and unyielding. "I will not fix his ledgers in the shadows while he publicly parades me as the disgrace of the Washington family." "What exactly does he want from me?" My mother flinched, finally looking me in the eyes. "He said he might need you to come by the corporate office next week, just to sign a few routine administrative confirmations from your time working there. He mentioned it would help clear up a minor compliance bottleneck." Lucas shifted in his chair beside me. I felt the dangerous heat radiating from his quiet anger. I finally broke the seal on the envelope and pulled out the stack of heavily redacted documents. It only took me 10 minutes of scanning the pages to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the disaster. The first few pages were aggressive warning letters from a major commercial bank regarding severe covenant breaches. The debt service coverage ratios had plummeted well below the legally mandated thresholds. The next section contained panicked, internal payment schedules showing that primary construction contractors had not been paid in over 90 days. But the most devastating document was tucked near the back. It was a collateral agreement. "Mother," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm, "do you know what the primary family trust is currently holding?" She blinked, her perfectly manicured fingers nervously twisting her silk scarf. "Well, it holds the liquid assets for my retirement, the legacy funds for the grandchildren, and the deed to the estate." "Not anymore," I corrected her. "This document shows that the trust has been pledged as secondary collateral against a high-risk commercial development loan. If that project defaults, the bank can legally seize the trust. Everything is exposed." The blood completely drained from her face. She had spent decades avoiding conflict, choosing the comfort of her wealthy bubble, and now the bubble was being repossessed. I turned to the next page, and my eyes locked onto a completely different kind of corporate poison. Interspersed among the vendor invoices were highly unusual consulting payouts and rebate transfers directed to an entity named Kendrick Land Advisory. I pushed the paper toward Lucas. He read the corporate name, and a harsh, cynical smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Preston," Lucas said, It was not a question. Exactly, I confirmed. I looked back at my mother, who was now trembling visibly. Preston is not just mismanaging the projects, he is actively bleeding them. He set up a ghost corporation to siphon vendor rebates and funnel consulting fees directly into his own pockets. He is stealing the remaining cash reserves while your husband blames the fluctuating housing market. Theodore kept saying it was just short-term cash flow maneuvering, my mother whispered, a single tear ruining her flawless makeup. He said everything would be fine once the new quarter closed. Why would he want you to sign old papers if Preston is the one taking the money? Because your husband does not need a daughter to come home and apologize, Lucas interjected, his voice cutting through the air like a heavy blade. He needs a certified forensic accountant with the last name Washington to formally validate a ledger that is currently bleeding out. If Madison signs those administrative confirmations, she retroactively blesses the forged financial timeline. She becomes the architect of the fraud in the eyes of the law. The absolute brilliance of the trap was sickening. My father was using Preston's greed to create a chaotic smokescreen, all while meticulously setting up the paperwork to ensure that when the federal investigators finally arrived, all the digital footprints would lead directly to my doorstep. He thought my mother's emotional manipulation would be the perfect bait to bring me back into the fold just long enough to secure my signature. I looked at the terrified woman sitting across from me. She was not a mastermind. She was just another expendable asset in Theodore Washington's portfolio. I carefully gathered the papers, aligned their edges, and placed them back inside the manila envelope. I did not hand it back to her. I slid it into my own leather briefcase. Tell him I am considering his request, I instructed my mother. Tell him I need a few days to review the implications before I agree to visit the office. Are you going to help us, Madison? She pleaded, her voice cracking. I stood up from the small table, buttoning my coat. I am going to do exactly what a forensic auditor is trained to do, I replied softly. I am going to establish the absolute truth. I walked out of the coffee shop with Lucas holding the door for me. I had absolutely no intention of saving the Washington Empire. I had taken possession of those documents for one singular purpose. I was going to use my father's own hidden records to build an impenetrable legal fortress around my husband and myself. And once we were safely outside the blast radius, I was going to systematically dismantle every single pillar of lies my father had spent his entire life building, ensuring he would never be able to control another human being again. The dining room of our bungalow transformed into a secure war room. Lucas and I hired an independent corporate litigator named David, a man whose ruthlessness in the courtroom matched my own in a spreadsheet. We spent 3 consecutive nights pinning documents to a massive corkboard, running red yarn between shell companies and bank wires, building a flawless timeline. We charted every single day from the exact moment I officially resigned from Washington's signature communities to the present hour. We cross-referenced archived emails, server access logs provided secretly by my brother, digital signature scans, and the heavily redacted loan addendums my mother had so helpfully delivered. The picture that emerged was not just corporate negligence, it was a meticulously premeditated crime. The most damning piece of evidence was the digital signature token. When I left my father's firm years ago, I had formally surrendered my encrypted universal serial bus drive, the physical key required to authorize high-level financial movements. Standard security protocol dictated it should have been immediately wiped and deactivated. However, David managed to subpoena the metadata from the bank's receiving servers. The electronic signature that pledged my personal liability on that disastrous mezzanine loan had been stamped using my exact, unique credential. More importantly, the Internet Protocol address attached to that digital stamp traced directly back to the private executive network at the Washington corporate headquarters. The date of the signature was a Tuesday in the middle of October, precisely the week Lucas and I were walking along a beach on our honeymoon. I was physically thousands of miles away, completely offline. I initiated a secure, encrypted call with Cole late that Thursday night to demand an explanation about the physical token. His voice trembled through the receiver. Dad never destroyed it, Madison, Cole confessed. his breath hitching. "I saw it in his private wall safe about 6 months ago, when I asked him why he still had your credential. He just waved me off. He said he kept it to handle urgent administrative processing, just in case a historical document needed a quick sign-off and you were unreachable." It was a sentence that sounded entirely mundane to a loyal son, yet it possessed enough venom to obliterate any remaining shred of ethical defense my father might claim. He had weaponized my past to finance his present, but my father was not the only one orchestrating a betrayal. The fragile alliance between my sister and her husband was violently shattering. Brenna showed up at my front porch on a rainy Sunday morning, completely unannounced. She wore dark sunglasses, zero makeup, and looked as though she had not slept in a week. She refused to come inside, standing under the dripping awning, shivering in the damp air. "You were right about him," Brenna whispered, her voice tight with suppressed rage and profound humiliation. "Preston is not just skimming off the top. He is actively building a lifeboat, and he is planning to drown the rest of us to keep it afloat." She had broken into his locked home office while he was away on a supposed golfing trip. Brenna found offshore bank routing numbers, aggressive cash transfers moving into private trusts entirely outside of their marital estate, and a drafted legal defense file. Preston was systematically hoarding millions of dollars. Worse, his defense file contained fabricated email chains designed to perfectly frame both my father and me for the misappropriated vendor funds. If the empire collapsed, Preston was fully prepared to walk away wealthy, leaving his wife's family to face the federal indictments. I took the copies Brenna handed me, promising to keep her name out of the initial strike. When I brought the vendor lists back to the dining room table, Lucas leaned over my shoulder to examine the newly acquired pages. Suddenly, his posture went entirely rigid. He reached out and tapped a heavy finger against a specific subcontractor listed under Preston's fraudulent disbursements. It was a steel framing company. "I know them," Lucas said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a dark, dangerous edge. "Madison, I sued that exact framing company 2 years ago. It was the catastrophic roof collapse case. The one where 3 men were nearly crushed to death because the contractor used substandard materials to cut costs." He stepped back from the table, his eyes wide as the true magnitude of the deception hit him. "During discovery for that lawsuit, we hit a massive brick wall regarding the parent developer. The framing company took a sudden, massive out-of-court settlement to keep the parent company's name sealed." Lucas looked at me, the realization striking us both like a physical blow. Theodore Washington had not hated Lucas because of his modest background, his off-the-rack suits, or his public university degree. My father had actively researched Lucas the moment I mentioned his name. He recognized the young, relentless plaintiff's attorney who had almost cracked open the shadow network of his unsafe labor practices 2 years prior. My father vehemently opposed our marriage because he knew Lucas was the only person with the precise legal expertise to connect the buried workplace injuries, the secret hush money settlements, and the heavily leveraged, fraudulent loan structures. We were not just a romantic inconvenience. We were a lethal combination of forensic and legal fire that could burn his entire legacy to the ground. By Wednesday, the silent pressure I had applied by holding on to the documents my mother gave me finally triggered a response. My father realized I had not blindly signed the papers. He realized I was digging. Sensing he was losing the narrative, Theodore abruptly shifted his tactical approach. He deployed his most insidious weapon, an offering of peace. He requested a private video conference. When his face appeared on my screen, he looked remarkably composed, projecting the benevolent patriarch. "Madison, I believe we let emotions cloud our better judgment at that dinner," my father said smoothly, offering a rare, calculated concession. "I am prepared to restore your full inheritance. I want you back on the foundation board. I want you holding a strategic role in steering this company through its current, minor market turbulence." He paused, letting the heavy promise of wealth and validation hang in the air. "All I need from you in return," he continued, his tone turning dangerously casual, "is for you to sign a comprehensive administrative release. Just a simple document cleaning up the old ledgers, verifying your past authorizations, so we can move forward as a united family. He was trying to bribe me with my own stolen money to sign my own death warrant. A year ago, I would have been furious. I would have yelled, accused him of forgery, and tipped my hand entirely. But sitting in my quiet home, backed by an arsenal of irrefutable evidence, I felt absolutely no anger. I felt a cold, supreme clarity. I looked directly into the camera lens. I let a slow, perfectly measured smile form on my face. "That is a very generous offer, Dad," I said, my voice completely smooth, devoid of any hesitation or sarcasm. "Send over the draft. I will review the terms and consider it carefully." I disconnected the call. I did not decline his offer. I gave him exactly the sliver of hope he needed to believe he was still the smartest man in the room. That was the precise moment the game fundamentally changed. I was no longer the discarded daughter scrambling for scraps of affection. I had just stepped behind the board, and I was the one actively setting the final trap. For 35 years, my mother had been a permanent, perfectly styled fixture within the oppressive walls of the lakefront estate. She was the compliant host, the silent observer, and the ultimate enabler of my father's iron-fisted rule. That era abruptly ended on a brisk Tuesday morning, without a single word of warning. Celeste Washington packed 3 large leather suitcases, summoned a private car, and walked out of the grand foyer forever. She did not move into a luxury hotel or a sprawling new mansion. She signed a lease on a modest 2-bedroom condominium located in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood across town. It was the very first autonomous action she had ever taken, and it caused Theodore to completely and violently lose his mind. My father was a man who calculated every variable. A defecting wife was a catastrophic breach of protocol. He bombarded her phone with demands, ordered his assistants to track her movements, and paced the empty halls of his house like a trapped predator. But my mother had not merely changed her address. She had quietly retained a ruthless, highly specialized family law attorney. Within 48 hours of her departure, her legal counsel filed a massive emergency injunction. The court order effectively froze all joint marital assets, completely paralyzing my father's ability to use their shared investment portfolios or the remaining equity in the estate as a protective cushion for his collapsing commercial loans. By trying to manipulate her into bringing me back into the fold, Theodore had inadvertently woken her up to the terrifying reality of her own financial ruin. Now, she was aggressively cutting off his oxygen supply. The dam was cracking, and the pressure was forcing everyone to abandon their carefully rehearsed roles. 2 days after my mother moved out, Brenna called me. We agreed to meet at a small, heavily wooded park situated halfway between our respective offices. She arrived wearing a heavy trench coat, looking exhausted but remarkably resolute. She did not waste time with small talk. She simply handed me a small digital audio recorder. I managed to access Preston's synchronized cloud storage before he changed the master passwords, Brenna explained, her breath visible in the cold morning air. He has been recording his phone calls with Dad for months, saving them as leverage. Listen to the track saved on the 2nd of October. I pressed the play button. The audio was slightly muffled, but my father's commanding, arrogant baritone was unmistakable. He was arguing with Preston about the rising risk of the fraudulent paperwork. Then, the undeniable confession echoed through the small speaker. "You are panicking over nothing, Preston." My father's recorded voice snapped. "Names in this house are family assets. They always have been. If we need to use Madison's name to keep the company alive and the lenders pacified, then it is still for the benefit of the family. She owes us that much. Process the digital paperwork and stop questioning my methods." It was the ultimate smoking gun. It bypassed all circumstantial evidence and delivered explicit, undeniable proof of premeditated corporate identity theft. I looked at my sister. The icy barrier that had separated us for decades was completely gone, replaced by a mutual, unspoken understanding that we were dealing with a monster. While Brenna secured the audio, our younger brother struck the most critical blow from inside the walls. Late on a Friday night, Cole sent a secure message indicating he was inside the corporate server room. Preston, realizing the walls were closing in, had hired a private tech contractor to permanently scrub the internal email archives and the metadata logs connecting the shell companies to the main ledger. But Cole, the brother everyone dismissed as weak and ineffective, had anticipated the move. Working in the dark at 2 o'clock in the morning, Cole successfully cloned the entire primary drive onto a high-capacity external hard drive just hours before Preston's team initiated the digital purge. Cole handed the drive to Lucas in a subterranean parking garage the following afternoon. The quiet middle child had just become the most vital link in our counterattack. As my biological family violently tore itself apart in the shadows, Lucas and I were thriving in the broad daylight. The stark contrast was almost poetic. I was officially promoted to Senior Management Director at Blue Aster Risk Group, handed a corner office, and given absolute authority over the largest forensic accounts in the firm. Simultaneously, Lucas was invited to be the keynote speaker at a highly publicized regional construction safety forum. He stood on a brightly lit stage, addressing hundreds of union leaders and municipal regulators, demanding stricter accountability for commercial developers. We were building a bulletproof, highly respected life purely on our own merit. The further we ascended, the more profoundly ridiculous my father's original accusation became. His claim that we possessed values fundamentally misaligned with the family legacy was now a public joke. We were the only ones living with actual integrity. However, Theodore Washington possessed a fatal flaw. His ego completely blinded him to reality. When he read about my promotion in the local business journal and saw Lucas gaining political traction, he severely misread the board. He did not see two formidable adversaries preparing a lethal strike. He saw a daughter whose newfound success must surely be making her nostalgic for her elite roots. He assumed my silence and my upward mobility meant I was finally ready to negotiate from a position of strength, eager to reclaim my rightful place in the dynasty. He decided to seize control of the narrative the only way he knew how. He sent an elegant, formally printed invitation requesting my presence at an estate mediation dinner. He deliberately chose the lake house as the venue, attempting to recreate the exact environment, the exact table, and the exact power dynamic he had utilized to banish me 8 months prior. He wanted to sit at the head of the mahogany table and play the magnanimous king offering a pardon. I responded immediately. I formally accepted the invitation. Word rapidly spread through the fractured family network. Preston assumed I was coming to cut a dirty deal to save my own skin. Brenna and Cole were terrified I was actually falling back under our father's spell. My mother sent a panicked text message, begging me not to sign anything. They all believed I was walking willingly into a slaughterhouse. They did not understand that I was not returning to seek a seat at his table. I was returning because I needed every single guilty party gathered in the exact same room, at the exact same time. I wanted to replicate the original trauma, but this time, I held the executioner's axe. What my father did not know, what absolutely no one in that fractured empire knew, was that our preparation was already finished. Exactly 24 hours before the scheduled dinner, I had packaged the cloned server data, the audio recordings, and the forensic timeline into a highly secure, encrypted digital vault. I did not send it to a lawyer. I sent it directly to the chief risk officers of the 3 primary commercial banks holding the heavily leveraged Washington Signature Community's debt. The bomb had already been planted under his throne, and the timer was actively counting down. The only variable left to decide at that dinner was whether I would let him detonate quietly behind closed doors, or if I would force him to burn in front of the entire world. The heavy mahogany doors of the lake house swung open to reveal a scene so desperately lavish it bordered on the grotesque. Crystal chandeliers blazed with the intensity of stage lights, illuminating massive floral arrangements of white hydrangeas and imported orchids. The dining room table was set with the family's finest antique silver, gleaming against heavy linen tablecloths. Anyone peering through the tall glass windows would assume the Washington family was simply resolving a minor, regrettable misunderstanding over roasted tenderloin and vintage Bordeaux. They would never guess the foundation beneath the hardwood floors was completely hollowed out by forgery and breach of fiduciary duty. We took our seats. The seating arrangement was a masterclass in fractured alliances. Preston sat to my right, leaning back with a sickeningly confident smirk, entirely convinced my father's vast influence would somehow shield him from his own massive embezzlement. Directly across from him, Brenna stared at her husband with an expression completely devoid of the deferential respect she had spent a decade cultivating. It was the icy, clinical gaze of a woman watching a terminal patient refuse treatment. My mother, Celeste, sat rigidly near the foot of the table, every line of her body tight with cold resolve. She had returned to this house solely as a legal observer, not a compliant wife. Next to her, Cole stared at his porcelain plate, his hands trembling so severely he did not even attempt to pick up his fork. At the head of the table, Theodore Washington played the benevolent king. For the first time in my entire 35 years of existence, he significantly lowered his voice when addressing me. He bypassed his usual commanding bark, adopting a tone of practiced, paternal warmth that made my skin crawl. "Madison," he began, swirling a heavy crystal glass of red wine. "We have all endured a terribly difficult 8 months, but the beautiful thing about a legacy is that certain fractures can always be repaired. Blood is blood, after all. You have proven yourself immensely capable out in the world, and I believe it is time to bring that capability back home where it truly belongs." He reached beside his plate and slid a thick, leather-bound folder down the polished length of the wood. It stopped precisely in front of my water glass. "Inside is a preliminary draft," my father continued smoothly. "It outlines the immediate restoration of your name to the primary living trust, along with a guaranteed seat on the future board of directors. You will have full executive voting rights." I did not touch the folder. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. "And what is the cost of this restoration?" I asked quietly. His smile tightened just a fraction of an inch. "Not a cost, simply a clarification. The draft includes a standard administrative release. It merely requires your signature confirming that all recent corporate guarantees attached to your name were executed with your full knowledge and consent. Furthermore, Lucas will have absolutely no legal standing or involvement in these specific corporate matters. Naturally, the entire reconciliation will be bound by an ironclad non-disclosure agreement." The trap was set perfectly in the open. A lesser person might have flipped the table or screamed about the digital forgery. I did neither. I channeled every hour of interrogation training I had ever received at the forensic accounting firm. I opened the leather folder, pulled out a gold pen from my purse, and began casually reviewing the dense legal paragraphs as if I were grading a mediocre term paper. "This is a fascinating structure," I murmured, turning the first page. "Though I do have a few minor technical questions. For instance, on page 4, regarding the mezzanine debt assumption. Can you clarify the exact date of execution? It appears to be late October." My father frowned, his posture stiffening slightly. "The specific dates are merely administrative placeholders. Madison. The lawyers will polish the timeline." "I see," I replied, making a small checkmark in the margin. "And who exactly witnessed this signature? Furthermore, why does the server access log indicate the electronic authorization was routed through a private internet protocol address originating from the 4th floor of your corporate headquarters, while I was completely out of the country?" The dining room fell into a suffocating, dead silence. Preston's arrogant smirk instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden, shallow panic. Cole squeezed his eyes shut. Before my father could formulate a lie, I turned to the next page. There is also the matter of the vendor rebates. Why would a person who was formally and publicly excised from this family 8 months ago suddenly appear in a brand new debt structure connected to Kendrick Land Advisory? That seems like an extraordinary liability for a woman who no longer holds the keys to the kingdom. My father's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. The carefully constructed mask of the forgiving patriarch shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered executive underneath. He finally realized I had not returned as a repentant daughter begging for her inheritance. I was a senior forensic investigator conducting a hostile deposition right inside his own dining room. You are intentionally overcomplicating a very generous lifeline, my father snapped, his voice rising to its familiar, punishing volume. You will sign the release, Madison. You owe this family your protection. Beside me, Lucas did not say a single word. He did not need to. He simply sat there, his broad shoulders squared, staring directly at my father with the heavy, unblinking intensity of a prosecutor watching a guilty man hang himself on the stand. It was a suffocating, judgmental silence that made every guilty person at the table squirm under the metaphorical spotlight. Lucas was the physical embodiment of the legal reckoning they all knew was coming. I let the silence stretch for exactly 20 seconds, letting the raw terror marinate in the room. Then, I calmly closed the leather folder. This is a highly complex arrangement, I said, my voice as smooth as glass. I cannot possibly sign a document of this magnitude without conducting a thorough review of the original appendices. I reached across the table and deliberately pulled the original, wet ink copies of the loan addendums and the non-disclosure agreements from beneath my father's secondary stack of papers. I slid them cleanly into my leather briefcase and snapped the brass lock shut. I will return tomorrow evening at exactly 8 o'clock, I announced, pushing my chair back and standing up. I will sign the final agreements then, assuming the math makes sense. My father let out a harsh, triumphant breath, his rigid posture relaxing just a fraction. In his unparalleled arrogance, he believed my demand for a 24-hour delay was simply a pathetic attempt to save face before ultimately surrendering to his authority. He believed he had won. He had absolutely no idea that by allowing me to casually walk out the front door with those original documents, he had just handed me the final, physical proof of his extortion attempt. I did not need his money, and I certainly did not need his name. I only needed the paper trail, and he had just gift-wrapped it for me. Tomorrow night, I would not be returning to sign a contract. I would be returning to light the match. Exactly 24 hours later, we walked back through the heavy oak doors of the lake house. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. The scene in the dining room was a ghost of the nightmare I had endured nearly a year prior. My father sat at the head of the table, dressed in a sharp blazer, his hands resting on a fresh stack of legal documents. He was ready to play the magnanimous patriarch one last time. The difference was that tonight, I did not walk in as the discarded daughter. I walked in as the executioner. As I took my seat, my father cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses. Now that we have all had time to reflect, he began, his voice dripping with forced benevolence, I will read the terms of the reconciliation. Upon your signature, your full inheritance will be restored, and we can move past this. I did not let him finish the sentence. I reached into my heavy leather bag, pulled out a massive, 4-inch thick binder, and dropped it onto the mahogany table. The loud thud echoed through the silent room, rattling the crystal water glasses. I am not signing your papers, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute, chilling clarity. But you are going to read mine. My father stopped. The benevolent smile froze on his face. Madison, what is the meaning of this? I opened the binder. This is a comprehensive forensic timeline of your corporate fraud, spanning the last 8 months, I declared, staring directly into his eyes. It details exactly how you illegally retained my encrypted digital signature token after I resigned. It proves, with Internet Protocol access logs, that you maliciously inserted my name into a multi-million-dollar guarantor amendment 2 weeks after my wedding, while I was completely out of the country. It outlines how you over-leveraged the family trust to cover your failing commercial loans. And, as a fascinating subplot, it tracks millions of dollars in stolen vendor rebates funneled directly through Kendrick Land Advisory. Preston shot up from his chair, his face entirely drained of color. That is a lie. You have absolutely no proof of that. Before Preston could scream another word, Lucas stood up. He did not yell. His courtroom voice was low, resonant, and entirely devastating. It is not a lie, Preston, Lucas said smoothly. We tracked the subcontractors you starved. I know them intimately. In fact, I sued one of them 2 years ago for a catastrophic roof collapse. Theodore, you knew exactly who I was from the moment Madison introduced us. You did not push Madison out of the family because you hated my working-class background. You excised her because you knew I had the legal expertise to connect your secret injury settlements to your fraudulent loan structures. You needed her legally isolated so she could not fight back when your house of cards finally collapsed. The room descended into absolute chaos, but we were just getting started. It was a perfectly choreographed ambush. Brenna reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and pressed play. My father's own voice filled the dining room, explicitly instructing Preston to use my name as a disposable family asset to keep the lenders pacified. My father's jaw dropped, his eyes darting toward his eldest daughter in pure shock. Cole, sitting quietly at the end of the table, pulled a printed stack of server logs from his jacket and slid them toward the center. "I cloned the mainframe, Dad," Cole whispered, his voice shaking but finally defiant. "I secured the backup data before Preston's tech team could scrub the digital footprint." At that exact moment, the heavy dining room doors opened again. My mother's private litigation attorney walked in, carrying a manila envelope. "Theodore," my mother said, her voice entirely devoid of the warmth she had faked for 35 years. "My legal counsel is serving you with the official asset freeze. You can no longer use my marital equity to cover your criminal negligence. I am filing for a legal separation." Right on cue, my phone vibrated on the table. I glanced at the screen and looked back at the terrified man sitting at the head of the table. "That is an email confirmation from the chief risk officer at your primary commercial bank," I announced. "They have officially received the full forensic review package." The illusion of power completely evaporated. My father panicked. He frantically pointed a trembling finger at Preston. "He did it!" Theodore shouted, completely losing his composure. Preston orchestrated the vendor theft, and Madison knew the corporate structure. She was the accountant. She set up those shell entities before she left. I did not even blink. I simply turned to the 4th tab in my binder. "Nice try," I replied coldly. "I have the security logs, my resignation date, our wedding date, and a chain of internal emails proving you actively locked me out of the executive network 3 full weeks before the forged paperwork was even drafted. You left the digital fingerprints everywhere." The dining room violently imploded. Preston started screaming, accusing Theodore of directing the entire embezzlement scheme. Theodore yelled back, his face purple with rage. My mother stood up, officially separating herself from the madness, demanding her separate assets be protected, and Brenna, for the very first time in her life, walked over and stood firmly behind my chair. Through the screaming and the accusations, my father looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, desperate realization. "Madison, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "We can fix this. I will put you back in the will. I will give you everything." That was the moment I delivered the final, fatal blow. "I do not want your money," I said softly, my quiet voice cutting through the noise of the room. "And I absolutely refuse to be reinstated in your will. I did not come back here to beg for a seat at a table that sold out its own blood for a signature. You can keep your broken legacy." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the binder. "Here are my terms. You will sign a public exoneration document clearing my name of all liability. You will immediately terminate all fraudulent obligations attached to my identity. You will release the funds to pay the contractors you starved, and you will grant Mother an equitable, uncontested exit from this toxic marriage. If you hesitate for a single second, Lucas and I will hand this entire binder to the federal prosecutor." I did not wait for his answer. I closed the binder, took my husband by the hand, and walked out of the lake house for the very last time. 6 months later, the fallout was absolute. Washington's signature communities was forced into a brutal corporate restructuring. The bank seized the lake house, selling it at a massive discount to cover the outstanding debts. Preston was currently fighting a multi-million-dollar civil investigation, while my father lived entirely alone in a small rented apartment, surrounded by boxes of useless legal papers and a legacy that had turned to ash. Lucas and I took the substantial, entirely legal settlement we secured from the parent company and used it to launch a vocational retraining fund for injured construction workers. It was a genuine legacy, born not from a bloodline, but from basic human dignity. As for me, I sit at the long, mismatched farmhouse table in my own dining room. The house is filled with the loud, joyful noise of our friends and the smell of good food. Lucas is sitting right beside me, laughing at a joke someone just told. I look down the length of the table, and I realize something beautiful. Nobody here is nervously checking the mood of the person sitting at the head. No one is afraid. And for the first time in my life, I truly understand that the night my father erased my name from his will was not a punishment. It was the exact moment he accidentally freed me from the conditional love that had kept me a prisoner my entire life. Thank you all so much for listening to my story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by pressing the hype button so that this story can be heard by many more people.